Not everyone and everything on the battlefield can be targeted during an armed conflict. The principle of distinction, one of the four fundamental principles of international humanitarian law, IHL, requires the parties to an armed conflict to distinguish between civilians and combatants, and between military objectives and civilian objects. Military objectives and combatants can be deliberately targeted. Civilians and civilian objects can never be deliberately targeted. While the fundamental principle of distinction is not specifically written into the four 1949 Geneva Conventions, it was included in the 1977 Additional Protocol 1, which supplements the four main conventions. Additional Protocol 1 addresses distinction in two places. In Article 44, it says, "In order to promote the protection of the civilian population from the effects of hostilities, combatants are obliged to distinguish themselves from the civilian population while they are engaged in an attack or in a military operation preparatory to an attack." It is also addressed in Article 48, where it says, "In order to ensure respect for and protection of the civilian population and civilian objects, the parties to the conflict shall at all times distinguish between the civilian population and combatants and between civilian objects and military objectives, and accordingly shall direct their operations only against military objectives." These two articles taken together create the modern IHL principle of distinction, which has two aspects. The first requires combatants to distinguish themselves from the civilians by taking steps to separate themselves from the civilian population. This is typically done by requiring the armed forces to wear uniforms or display a distinctive emblem that is visible from a distance so that the enemy will not confuse the combatants with the civilian population. Additionally, they should not locate military objectives, for example, radar stations and anti-aircraft guns, close to civilian objects. Placing military objectives close to civilian objects forces the enemy to choose between attacking a military object and harming civilians, or refraining from attack to safeguard civilians. The second aspect of distinction requires that before conducting an attack, parties must distinguish between combatants and civilian objects and military objectives. They must take all reasonable steps to ensure the weapons and tactics they use in the attack are directed only at combatants and military objectives. Some types of landmines are simply placed in the ground and left to be triggered by whomever steps on it. This type of landmine is a good example of a weapon that violates the principle of distinction because it is by its nature indiscriminate. Whoever triggers the mine causes it to explode regardless of whether the person is a civilian or a combatant. When the mine is buried, there is no way to target it directly to combatants and no way to tell if it will ultimately harm a combatant or civilian. IHL recognizes that civilians and their objects cannot be completely spared from the violence and destruction that is always part of armed conflict. However, it does seek to limit the effects of armed conflict on civilians. The principle of distinction, along with the other three fundamental principles, are how IHL attempts to protect the victims of armed conflict. Produced by the American Red Cross. If you have any questions, please contact ihlaw@redcross.org.